Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving deep into A Course in Miracles today, specifically Lesson 74. There is no will but God's.
Ooh, that's a good one.
I know, right?
Uh,
This one from the notes you sent over really seems to have piqued your interest.
yeah, for sure. It's a concept that,
And I get it, it can be a bit of a head scratcher at first, but that's why we're here. We're going to break it all down, what it really means and how it can apply to your life. Make it practical.
I'm all about that.
Awesome.
Definitely a powerful lesson, that's for sure. Like you said, it can seem a bit counterintuitive when you first encounter it, but it flows so well from Lesson 73, remember that one?
Yeah.
All about how our thoughts create our reality.
Oh yeah, A Course in Miracles is big on the whole mind over matter thing.
Exactly. Lesson 73 is there to remind us that what we experience is shaped by, well, our beliefs and perceptions. And then Lesson 74 takes that and kind of pushes it further. It asks us to consider where those beliefs and perceptions come from in the first place.
Ooh, I like where this is going. Okay, so let's get into the core of Lesson 74. There is no will but God's. I mean, what does that even mean?
It's a bold statement, right? It really challenges how we normally think about free will. Basically, what the Course is saying is that there's a bigger universal will, sometimes called God's will or divine will, and this will governs everything.
Everything.
Everything. Our desires, our plans, even those times when we feel like, hey, I'm making this choice all on my own. It's all part of this bigger tapestry.
Okay, I think I see where some people might get a little, well, resistant to this idea.
How so?
Because if there's only this one will, does that make us all puppets? Like we don't have any real choice in the matter?
That's a totally valid question. And the Course isn't saying we should just become passive and give up our ability to make choices. Not at all.
So it's not about erasing our will completely.
No, it's more about understanding will in a new way. Think of it less like being a puppet and more like, becoming an instrument.
An instrument. Ooh, I like that analogy.
Right. There's still action involved. You're participating. But maybe you're not the one composing every single note.
Okay, so how does this all tie back to the idea of God's will?
The Course emphasizes that when we cling super tightly to our own, well, limited desires, the ones driven by our ego, we often end up creating conflict and suffering. It's like swimming against the current all the time. You get exhausted and don't really get anywhere.
Yeah, I can see that. It's like that constant striving for things that never seem to quite satisfy.
Exactly. So this clash between our ego's will and this larger divine will, that's what causes a lot of our inner turmoil.
Okay, I'm starting to see how those two wills could be at odds. Can you give me an example of what that might feel like in real life?
Sure, think about a time when you had a big decision to make. Maybe a career change or a relationship dilemma.
Oh, haven't we all been there at some point?
Right. Remember that feeling of being pulled in opposite directions, unsure which path to take? That back and forth inside your head?
Oh, yeah, like when your gut says one thing, but your mind is screaming something totally different?
Bingo. That's the tension between your personal will, often driven by fear or a need to control, and, well, a subtler pull toward what the Course suggests might be a more aligned path.
I'm starting to get a feel for the concept now, but this divine will, it still seems so abstract. If we're not supposed to be forcing our own will all the time, how do we even start to recognize what this other will is?
It's definitely not always easy, but the Course does offer some guidance.
Okay, good, because otherwise we're just wandering around in the dark here.
Right. So the Course suggests that instead of fixating on what we want, we try shifting our focus to what might be the most loving, compassionate, and beneficial course of action.
Not just for ourselves, but for everyone involved.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond that narrow, ego-driven perspective and tapping into a greater sense of purpose.
Okay, so surrender in this context isn't about becoming passive or giving up our ability to choose.
Nope, not at all.
It's more about aligning ourselves with something bigger than ourselves.
Precisely. It's about choosing to trust that there's a wisdom beyond our limited human understanding, a wisdom that's guiding us towards what's truly in our best interest.
I really like that. Okay, I'm with you so far, but I know our listeners are probably thinking, this all sounds great in theory, but how do I actually do this?
I knew you were going to ask that. And you know what? That's where things get really interesting, because the Course actually gives us some practical tools to work with.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
All right, so one of the most important tools is this practice of mindful decision-making.
Mindful decision-making, huh? Sounds intriguing. What's that all about?
Well, before you jump into any action, you pause for a second and ask yourself, is this choice I'm about to make, is it coming from a place of fear, lack, maybe a need to control, Or is it rooted in love, compassion, a desire to contribute to something bigger than myself?
Wow, that's a powerful question.
Right. It forces us to really examine what's driving our choices.
It's like taking a good hard look in the mirror.
Yeah, kind of. The Course calls this self-reflection another powerful tool.
Self-reflection, so like journaling, meditation, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Taking the time to really look inward, to sit with yourself and reflect on your desires, your actions, and your reactions, all of that can help you become more aware of where your choices are coming from in the first place.
It's like taking inventory of our inner world, figuring out what's driving us.
You got it. And you might start to see some patterns emerge.
What kind of patterns?
Like, okay, when I'm acting from a place of fear, things tend to get messy. But when I choose from a place of love, even if it's challenging, things seem to flow better.
Makes sense. So it's about becoming more aware of the energy we're bringing to our choices, seeing what happens when we act from different places.
You're getting it. And as you practice this awareness, you'll start to distinguish between the voice of your ego, the one all about fear and lack, and those subtler whispers that might be aligned with something bigger.
Okay, so it's not like a switch we just flip overnight.
Nope.
It's a process of refinement, like fine-tuning our inner compass.
Exactly. It's a process of learning to surrender our limited viewpoint and opening ourselves up to a wisdom that goes beyond what we think we know.
I'm really loving where this is going. It's about trusting in something larger, even when we can't see the full picture.
And with that trust comes a sense of peace and freedom. It's pretty amazing.
So we've talked about mindful decision-making, self-reflection. Those are two big tools, right? Anything else the Course suggests to help us align with this idea of God's will?
Oh yeah, there's more. Conflict resolution.
Conflict resolution.
I wouldn't have thought of that. How does that tie into all of this?
Well, you know how it is when you're clashing with someone? It's easy to get stuck in your own head, in your ego's need to be right.
Oh, absolutely. You dig in your heels, defend your position. The whole thing can spiral out of control so fast.
For sure. But if we can remember that there's a higher will at play, even just for a second, a purpose we might not fully grasp at that moment, it can change the whole dynamic.
So instead of going head to head, we try to approach the conflict with more understanding. You got it. We asked, how can I help find a solution that benefits everyone, not just me? We try to understand the other person's perspective, even if we don't agree with it.
Right, and that can be tough.
No doubt, but we look for common ground, for solutions that come from love and compassion, instead of fear and judgment.
That sounds like a much better and probably more effective way to handle conflict.
Right. It's way more likely to lead to a resolution that actually reflects a greater good, something that's more in line with that higher will we've been talking about.
This has been super insightful. I'm already feeling like I'm seeing things a little differently.
Me too.
But I know there's this big question that's probably on everyone's mind right now.
Ooh. Yeah, I think I know what you're going for.
The question we all wrestle with when this idea of God's will comes up.
Lay it on me.
How do we actually know what God's will is? How do we separate it from our ego's desires? And, how do we know we're not just making it all up to fit what we want?
Ugh, the million-dollar question. But you know what? A Course in Miracles has some surprisingly practical guidance on that.
Okay, this is where things get really interesting. We're going to dive into how to tell the difference between our will and God's will right after this quick break.
All right, so where were we? Ah, yes, the big question. How do we actually know what God's will is? It can be a bit overwhelming, especially when we're so used to relying on our own, judgment and desires.
It's easy to get caught up in that fear of making the wrong choice,
Yeah.
Like, what if I mess this up? What if I miss the mark when it comes to this whole aligning with God's will thing?
Oh, that fear is totally understandable, for sure. And A Course in Miracles gets that. But it also offers this really helpful way of looking at it differently. Instead of getting all hung up on right versus wrong, it encourages us to approach decisions from a place of alignment.
Okay, alignment. I
Yeah.
like that. It feels less, judgmental, more like we're tuning into something rather than stressing about getting it perfect.
Exactly. It's a process. And the Course actually gives us some pointers to help us with this whole tuning in thing. One of the big ones is to look at the why behind what we want.
So it's not just about what we desire, but the motivation behind it.
You got it. It's about asking, why do I want this? What's really driving me? Remember how we were talking about the ego and how it can get in the way of aligning with God's will? Well, the Course suggests that if our desires are coming from a place of fear, lack, or a need to control, then they're probably coming from our ego.
That makes sense. If our ego's running the show, we might end up chasing things that don't actually bring us lasting happiness.
Exactly. The Course is all about aligning with love, joy, peace, expansion, all that good stuff. So if a desire brings up a bunch of anxiety, stress, or that feeling of I need to prove myself, well, that might be a clue that it's not coming from the most aligned place.
So we should pay attention to how we feel when we're making a decision. Use our emotions as a guide.
Absolutely. Our feelings can be super insightful. It's not about becoming, emotionless robots. It's about tuning into our emotional landscape to get a better sense of what's motivating us. If a decision feels expansive, joyful, and aligned with our values, that's a good sign. But if it feels constricting, fear-based, or like we're trying to prove something, that's when we might want to pause and check in with ourselves a little deeper.
Okay, that's really helpful. But what about when life throws us curveballs? Those times when we're dealing with tough stuff. How does this whole God's will thing fit in with the reality of suffering?
That is a big question, and it's something people often struggle with when they first encounter this concept. It's important to remember that the Courses isn't saying we should ignore suffering or pretend it doesn't exist.
Right, because it definitely does.
It acknowledges that pain and loss are part of the human experience.
So it's not about sugarcoating things, but then how do we reconcile the idea of a loving God with all the bad stuff that happens in the world?
That's where our perception comes in. A Course in Miracles suggests that how we label things as good or bad, right or wrong, well, a lot of times that's based on our limited human understanding. It's filtered through our ego's perspective.
So we're judging things based on our own narrow viewpoint, not necessarily from a place of higher awareness.
You got it. The ego sees the world as this big duality, good versus bad, us versus them. But the Course invites us to open up to a different possibility. That everything, even the stuff that seems total messed up, could be part of a bigger divine unfolding. It's like we're all part of this giant cosmic play, and we don't always know the script.
I can see how that shift in perspective could be helpful, but it's still a huge leap to make, especially when we're in pain ourselves or seeing people we love hurting.
For sure. It's a big leap. And A Course in Miracles gets that. It doesn't expect us to just bypass our emotions or pretend pain isn't real, but it does offer a new way of relating to that suffering, a way to find meaning and purpose within it.
So it's not about denying or suppressing our feelings, but maybe learning how to hold them differently, finding a way to grow and heal even in the face of difficult experiences.
Exactly. The Course suggests that even in the darkest times, there's an opportunity for us to wake up spiritually. When we surrender to God's will, even when it doesn't make sense, we open ourselves to a wisdom that goes beyond our limited human understanding.
It's not passive acceptance. It's about trusting and surrendering even when things are tough.
You got it. And that's where all those practices we talked about, mindful decision-making, self-reflection, checking our motivations, they become even more important. They help us cultivate the inner strength and clarity to navigate challenges with grace and resilience, like building muscles for our spiritual journey.
It's like building a bridge between our human experience and that deeper spiritual awareness.
Beautifully said. And that brings us to another important piece that the Course highlights: forgiveness.
Forgiveness. I'm curious how that fits into all of this.
Well, A Course in Miracles suggests that one of the biggest things blocking us from aligning with God's will is, well, holding on to grudges, resentments, judgments, all that negativity.
So we're talking about more than just forgiving someone who's wronged us.
Right. It's about letting go of all those thoughts and feelings that keep us stuck in a cycle of pain and separation. It's like we're carrying around all this baggage that weighs us down.
It sounds like forgiveness is more about our own healing and freedom than anything else.
Exactly. The Course invites us to see forgiveness as a radical act of self-love. It's about freeing ourselves from the past and opening up to a more loving and joyful present.
This is powerful stuff, but forgiveness can be really hard, especially when we've been hurt deeply. Any advice on how to approach forgiveness in a way that feels genuine?
That's a great question, and honestly, it's something we could spend a whole other deep dive exploring. But for now, I'll offer a couple of things to keep in mind. First, remember forgiveness is a journey, not a destination. It takes time, patience, compassion. It unfolds in layers.
It's not about forcing it or pretending we're not hurt.
Exactly. And another important point is that forgiving someone doesn't mean condoning their actions or staying in a situation that's not healthy for us.
So it's not about letting people off the hook or saying that what they did was okay.
Right. It's about releasing that negative energy we're holding on to so we can move forward with clarity and peace. It's for us, not for them.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
So ultimately, forgiveness is about aligning with God's will, even when it's really difficult.
Beautifully said. When we choose to forgive, we're choosing to see ourselves and others through the eyes of love and compassion. It's about recognizing our shared humanity, our interconnectedness. It's powerful stuff.
This has been such an incredible exploration of Lesson 74. We've covered so much ground, from the big ideas to the practical tools, and I'm already feeling a shift in my own thinking.
Me too. It's amazing how these concepts can really change how we see the world.
I know our listeners are probably buzzing with thoughts and questions right now, and there's one big one we haven't fully addressed yet. It's the question that comes up when we start to grasp this idea that everything is unfolding according to a divine plan, that everything is ultimately part of God's will.
Ah, yes. I think I know what you're getting at. It's the question that can really make us wrestle with these ideas.
Exactly. If everything that happens is part of God's will, then how do we make sense of the suffering in the world? How do we reconcile that idea with pain, injustice, all the things that seem so wrong?
Mm.
The heavy question, but one we're going to tackle head on right after this. All right, so we're back, and I feel like this is where things can get kind of tricky. We've been talking about aligning with God's will, trusting that there's this higher purpose at work in our lives.
Cool.
But then, we look around and see all this suffering, injustice, things that just seem plain wrong. So how do we square those two things?
It's the age-old question, isn't it? And it's a question that A Course in Miracles tackles head-on, but not always in a way that's super easy to grasp?
Yeah, I get that. Because if everything is part of God's will, does that mean those painful things are also part of the plan? That can be a tough pill to swallow.
Absolutely. And the Course isn't trying to oversimplify things or offer some easy answer to this really complex question. It's not about pretending suffering doesn't matter.
Yeah, because it definitely does.
It acknowledges that pain and loss, they're part of the human experience. They're real.
Okay, so it's not about denying the darkness, but then how do we make sense of it? How do we hold this idea of a loving God with all the bad stuff that's happening?
This is where the idea of perception becomes really key. The Course suggests that our perception of what's good or bad, right or wrong, a lot of times that's coming from our limited human understanding. It's filtered through our ego.
So we're making judgments based on our own narrow viewpoint, not necessarily from a place of higher awareness.
You got it. Our ego loves duality. It wants to divide everything into good versus bad, us versus them, victim versus perpetrator. But On Course in Miracles is like, hold on a sec. What if there's another way to see things?
A way that doesn't involve all that separation.
Exactly. It invites us to consider that maybe, just maybe, everything, even the painful stuff, is part of this larger unfolding. Like we're all characters in this cosmic play, and we don't have the whole script?
Okay, I can see how that shift in perspective could be helpful, but it still feels like a big leap,
Mm-hmm.
especially when we're going through tough times ourselves or watching people we love struggle.
It is a big leap, and the Course acknowledges that. It doesn't say, hey, just bypass all your human emotions, pretend the pain isn't there. But it does give us a different way to relate to that suffering, a way to find meaning, even purpose within it.
So it's not about denying how we feel, but maybe finding a new way to be with those feelings, a way to grow and heal, even when things are really hard.
You're getting it. The Course suggests that even in those dark moments, there's this potential for us to wake up spiritually. When we surrender to God's will, even when we don't get it, even when it hurts, we open ourselves to a wisdom that goes beyond our human minds.
It's not about giving up or resigning ourselves to suffering. It's about that trust, that surrender to something bigger, even when it doesn't make sense.
Beautifully said. And that's where all those practices we've been talking about, the mindful decision-making, the self-reflection, the looking at our motivations, choosing forgiveness, that's where those practices really come in handy. They help us build that inner strength, that clarity, so we can face those hard times with a little more grace and resilience.
Yeah, it's like we're building muscles for our spiritual journey.
I love that. And that's a really beautiful takeaway for our listeners today. Lesson 74 invites us into this huge shift in how we see things. It can be a bit scary at times, but it can also be incredibly freeing. It's about remembering that we're not alone. There's this loving intelligence guiding us, even when we can't see the path ahead.
This has been such a deep dive. I'm walking away with a lot to think about, and I hope our listeners are too. It seems like the big lesson here is that aligning with God's will isn't about reaching some perfect state. It's a journey, a process of learning, growing, and surrendering to something much bigger than ourselves.
And within that surrender, we find peace, purpose, connection. And
Yeah,
that's something that can carry us through anything.
absolutely. Thanks for being here today, and thank you all for listening. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you tomorrow for another deep dive.